She was just a quiet black waitress moving between glittering tables at a luxury wedding rehearsal dinner, until the arrogant bride-to-be called her clumsy and humiliated her in front of everyone. But what no one knew, this waitress was actually the billionaire owner of the entire catering empire. And before the night was over, the bride would lose everything she thought she owned, starting with her wedding. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story is already hitting home, make sure you hit that like button. The grand ballroom of the Solaris Hotel was a universe of shimmering gold and whispered promises. Crystal glasses filled with bubbling champagne that cost more than a month's rent for most people clinked together in a delicate symphony. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music a silken thread weaving through the conversations of the city's elite. Every detail was perfect, meticulously planned to reflect the immense wealth of the Hale and Clark families, soon to be united by marriage. This was not just a rehearsal dinner. It was a declaration of power, a spectacle of status. The air smelled of expensive perfume, gourmet food, and money, mountains of it. Danielle Rhodes moved through this glittering world like a shadow. Her black uniform was simple but immaculate, a stark contrast to the designer gowns and tailored suits that surrounded her. She was a ghost at the feast, her presence required but her existence ignored. She balanced a heavy silver tray laden with champagne flutes, her movements fluid and practiced. Her face was a mask of professional calm, her eyes taking in everything but revealing nothing. This was her company's newest acquisition, the Solaris Catering division, and she had heard whispers of trouble. Rumors of staff mistreatment and a decline in standards had reached her, and Danielle Rhodes was a woman who trusted her own eyes above all else. So, for the past week, she had traded her CEO's suit for a waitress's apron. She needed to see the truth for herself, unfiltered by reports and middle managers. Her focus was absolute as she navigated the crowded space. She passed a table where a man in a tuxedo laughed loudly, his face red from wine and self-importance. She skirted a group of women whose diamonds caught the light, their chatter a sharp bird-like sound. Then she approached the main table, the throne of this temporary kingdom. There sat Brittany Hale, the bride-to-be, the epicenter of the evening's universe. Brittany was radiant, a princess from a modern fairy tale. Her dress, a creation of silk and lace, shimmered under the chandeliers. Her blonde hair was styled in an intricate updo, and a diamond necklace glittered at her throat. She held court, her laughter loud and commanding, her every gesture designed to draw attention. Her fiancé, Mark Hale, sat beside her, his smile pleasant but his eyes distant, as if he were a supporting actor in a play he hadn't rehearsed for. Danielle approached their table, her steps silent on the thick carpet. She was there to refill their glasses, a simple routine task. As she leaned in, a guest, eager to get the bride's attention, shifted his chair back abruptly. The leg of the chair caught Danielle's ankle just for a fraction of a second. It was a small, almost imperceptible jolt, but it was enough. The laws of physics took over. One of the champagne flutes on her tray tilted, wobbled, and then tipped. Time seemed to slow down. Danielle watched, her mind a strange island of calm in the impending disaster, as the golden liquid arced through the air. It was a graceful, almost beautiful curve, a liquid sunbeam in the warm light of the ballroom. Then it landed, not on the floor, not on the table, but directly onto the pristine white silk of Brittany Hale's designer gown. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The string quartet faltered, a single violin note hanging in the sudden, shocking silence. Every eye in the ballroom swiveled to the head table. The splash of champagne on Brittany's dress was a dark, spreading stain, a blot on the perfect picture. Brittany's smile did not just vanish, it shattered. For a moment, she stared down at her dress in disbelief, her mind refusing to process the imperfection. Then, her head snapped up, her blue eyes, once sparkling with joy, now 2 chips of ice. Her gaze locked onto Danielle. "Watch where you're going, Clumsy," she snapped. The words were sharp and ugly, cutting through the stunned silence like broken glass. Guests froze, their wine glasses halfway to their lips. The staff along the walls stood a little straighter, their faces carefully blank. This was the moment the dream shattered and the nightmare began. Danielle's training kicked in. She kept her head bowed, her voice low and steady. "I am so sorry, ma'am. It was an accident." She reached for a napkin on her tray, intending to help, but Brittany recoiled as if Danielle were carrying a disease. "Don't touch me!" Brittany's voice rose, shrill and laced with venom. She stood up, pushing her chair back with a scrape that grated on everyone's nerves. She held the stained portion of her dress away from her body with 2 fingers, her face twisted in a mask of pure disgust. "Look what you did. This is a custom gown. It costs more than you make in a year." The insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. This was more than just a bride's frustration. This was cruelty. This was a public execution of a person Brittany saw as less than human. Danielle said nothing. She simply stood there, head still slightly bowed, absorbing the verbal assault. Her calmness seemed to infuriate Brittany even more. "What are you standing there for?" Brittany continued, her voice growing louder. "Are you stupid as well as clumsy? Look at you in that cheap, ugly uniform. You have no business working at a place like this. You're unprofessional. You're incompetent." Mark, her fiancé, finally stirred. He placed a hand on her arm. "Brittany, calm down. It was just an accident." She shook him off, her rage now a wildfire out of control. "No, Mark, I will not calm down. This is our rehearsal dinner. It's supposed to be perfect, and this person ruined it." She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Danielle. "I want her fired right now. I want her out of my sight." The demand echoed through the silent room. All eyes turned to Chef Anton, the head chef, who had rushed over from the kitchen door, his face pale and sweating. He was a man caught between a rock and a hard place, a furious, high-paying client, and the basic dignity of his staff. He wrung his hands, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. He knew the Hale wedding contract was one of the biggest his division had ever landed. He couldn't afford to lose it. But before he could stammer out an apology or a promise, Danielle acted. She did not cry. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply placed the heavy silver tray on a nearby table with a quiet, deliberate click. The sound was small, but it resonated in the tense silence. Then she straightened up. For the first time, she lifted her head and looked directly at Brittany Hale. Her eyes were not filled with fear or shame. They were steady, calm, and clear. They held a depth that Brittany, in all her spoiled, shallow life, could never comprehend. It was a look of assessment, of finality. It was the look of a judge delivering a silent verdict. The calm in Danielle's eyes unnerved everyone, most of all Brittany. The bride took an involuntary step back, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face for the first time. It was as if she had kicked a stone only to find it was the peak of a mountain. Without a single word, Danielle turned her back on the bride, on the head table, on the hundreds of staring guests. She walked away, her posture perfect, her steps unhurried. She walked out of the golden ballroom, leaving behind a scene of electric tension and a bride who had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The fairy tale was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The swinging doors of the ballroom closed behind Danielle, muffling the sudden explosion of whispers and nervous chatter. She entered the organized chaos of the back kitchen, a world away from the golden splendor she had just left. Here the air was hot and thick with the smells of sizzling butter, roasting meats, and simmering sauces. The clang of pots and pans, the sharp chop of knives, and the clipped orders of chefs formed a rhythm that was usually comforting to her. Tonight, it felt different. As she walked through the bustling space, the kitchen staff fell silent. The news had traveled faster than a fire on a gas line. Every head turned to watch her. Some faces showed sympathy, others a kind of nervous relief that it hadn't been them. A few, the ones who had been working there the longest and had grown cynical, wore faint, mocking smirks. They had seen this happen before. A rich client snaps, and a worker bee gets squashed. It was the law of their jungle. Evan Clark, a young sous chef with a shock of brown hair and earnest eyes, watched her from his station. He had been plating a delicate arrangement of seared scallops when he heard the commotion. Now he wiped his hands on his apron, his heart pounding with a sense of injustice. He had heard Brittany's shrill voice cut through the doors. He had seen the way Danielle had walked out, with a dignity that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. He muttered to the line cook next to him. That was completely out of line. The woman was a monster. The line cook, a grizzled veteran named Sal, just shrugged. "Keep your head down, kid. That monster is paying all our salaries this month. You want to keep your job, you learn to ignore it." Chef Anton burst through the doors, his face still pale, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Everyone back to work!" he barked, his voice tight with stress. He saw Danielle standing by the locker area and hurried over, his tone a mixture of frustration and forced apology. "Look, I'm sorry about that. She's a difficult client." Danielle simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She turned to her locker, her movement slow and deliberate. Chef Anton misinterpreted her silence. "I'll talk to the planner. Maybe I can smooth things over. We can't lose this deal. It's $1 billion account for the parent company, you understand? $1 billion. He said the words as if they were a magic incantation that could excuse any sin. He thought he was explaining the grim reality of their business to a lowly waitress. Evan watched the exchange from across the kitchen. He saw the desperation in Chef Anton's eyes, the frantic need to please the money at all costs. But he also saw the quiet stillness in Danielle. She wasn't acting like someone who had just been fired and publicly humiliated. There was no panic in her eyes, no tremor in her hands. There was only a profound, unshakable calm. Danielle reached for her apron, the one Brittany had called cheap and ugly. Her fingers went to the knot at her back. As she began to untie it, Evan noticed something that made him freeze. As her sleeve shifted, a small, almost hidden detail became visible on the inside cuff of her uniform shirt. It was a small, exquisitely embroidered logo, a stylized R and C intertwined, the insignia of the Rhodes Culinary Group, the parent company, the empire. Evan's eyes widened in disbelief. He had only seen that logo once before in the orientation manual, right next to the signature of the company's founder and CEO, a figure who was more of a legend than a person to the kitchen staff. A mysterious, brilliant entrepreneur who had built a catering empire from the ground up. Danielle finished untying her apron. She folded it neatly, almost ceremoniously, and placed it on the bench. She felt Evan's eyes on her and turned her head slightly. Their gazes met across the noisy kitchen. For a fleeting moment, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of happiness, but of acknowledgement. It was a smile that said, "I see you. You see it too." It was a shared secret in a room full of noise. She walked towards him, her path taking her right past his station on her way to the back exit. As she passed, she paused, her voice so soft that only he could hear it over the kitchen clatter. "You did your best tonight," she said, her eyes glancing at the perfectly seared scallops he had been preparing. "The food looked wonderful. Keep that passion." Before Evan could form a reply, before his stunned mind could process what was happening, she was gone. She pushed open the heavy steel door at the back of the kitchen and stepped out into the cool night air. The door swung shut behind her, cutting off the sounds of the kitchen and leaving a wake of stunned silence. The staff stared at the closed door, then at each other. Most of them thought the same thing. The poor woman had just been fired in the most brutal way possible. They felt a pang of pity, then quickly turned back to their stations, eager to forget and move on. The machine had to keep running. But Evan Clark couldn't move. He stood frozen, his mind reeling. The embroidered insignia, the quiet dignity, the strange, knowing smile, the parting words of encouragement. It didn't add up. People who got fired didn't act like that. They cried, they yelled, they pleaded. They didn't walk out with the quiet authority of a queen leaving her castle. He looked down at his scallops, his passion for the food suddenly reignited by her words. Then he looked back at the door she had disappeared through. A powerful, thrilling, and terrifying thought began to form in his mind. That woman wasn't just a waitress. He didn't know who she was, but he sensed with a certainty that shook him to his core that something much bigger was brewing. The storm hadn't just passed. It was just getting started. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of soft gray and pale orange, casting long shadows across the city. Far above the waking metropolis, in a penthouse apartment that was the epitome of minimalist luxury, Danielle Rhodes was already at work. There were no opulent decorations, no gold leaf furniture. The space was clean, functional, and offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. It was the home of a person who valued clarity and vision above all else. She sat at a large glass desk, a single laptop open before her. A cup of black coffee steamed gently beside her hand. She wore a simple gray sweatsuit, a far cry from the waitress uniform of the night before, and an even farther cry from the power suit she usually wore to board meetings. But here in the solitude of her private sanctuary, she was neither a waitress nor a CEO. She was simply Danielle, a woman reinforcing the foundations of her own convictions. A small window on her laptop screen played a silent video. It was the security footage from the Solaris ballroom. The video quality was crystal clear. She watched the scene unfold with a detached, analytical calm. She saw herself moving through the crowd. She saw the guest's chair move. She saw the glass tip, the champagne spill. She saw Brittany Hale's face contort from perfect bride to furious harpy. She listened to the audio on a separate track, her own voice quiet and apologetic. Brittany's voice loud, shrill, and dripping with contempt. Clumsy. Cheap, ugly uniform. I want her fired. The words echoed in the quiet room, but they did not sting. They were not personal insults to Danielle. They were data points. They were the confirmation of the ugly rumors she had come to investigate. The story of Danielle Rhodes was not one of inherited wealth or lucky breaks. She had built the Rhodes Culinary Group from a small, one-woman catering operation run out of her own apartment kitchen. She had scrubbed pots, hauled crates, and worked 18-hour days. She remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to be treated as less than because of the uniform she wore or the job she did. She remembered the sting of a dismissive word, the casual cruelty of a wealthy client who saw her as a servant, not a person. It was precisely because of those memories that she had built her empire on a single, unshakable principle: respect. It was the first word in her company's mission statement. It was the core value she drilled into every manager, every chef, every single employee from the boardroom to the dish pit. No one deserves disrespect, she would say in her company-wide addresses. Not in my kitchens, not at my events, not ever. We are a team, and we treat each other and our clients with dignity. And we demand that same dignity in return. The acquisition of the Solaris Catering division had been a major strategic move, a billion-dollar partnership that would solidify Rhodes Culinary Group's dominance in the luxury market. But the ink was barely dry on the initial contracts when the whispers started. Anonymous emails to her executive office, a sudden spike in staff turnover, vague complaints about a toxic client environment. The division's management, led by Chef Anton, had been dismissive, blaming it on growing pains and difficult high-end clients. Danielle knew better. She knew that a culture rots from the top down, or in this case, from the client in. The Hale wedding was the division's most prestigious event, a final test before the partnership was fully finalized, and a massive merger proposal was signed. It was supposed to be a showcase of excellence. Instead, Brittany Hale's cruelty had turned it into a case study, and Danielle had all the evidence she needed. Her personal creed was simple. I will never ask anyone to endure something I am not willing to endure myself. By putting on that apron, she had put her own creed to the test. The results were clear. The culture at the Solaris division was broken. Chef Anton, in his fear and deference to the client, had allowed it to be. He had been ready to sacrifice an employee to appease a bully. That was a failure of leadership Danielle could not tolerate. She closed the video file. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a glint of steel. There was no anger, no thirst for revenge. There was only a quiet, resolute purpose. This was not about a stained dress or a few harsh words. This was about the fundamental values upon which she had built her entire life's work. Brittany Hale hadn't just insulted a waitress. She had attacked the very soul of the Rhodes Culinary Group. And that was an attack Danielle would not let stand. She picked up a sleek black fountain pen and opened a leather-bound planner on her desk. The page was dated for today. In the space for her morning appointments, she wrote a single decisive note. Her handwriting was neat and precise. Rhodes Hale contract. Terminate immediately. She underlined the words twice. The decision was made. The consequences would be vast. A tidal wave that would crash over the Hale family, the Solaris division, and a billion-dollar merger. But for Danielle, it was simple. A line had been crossed. An empire built on respect could not, would not, do business with those who dealt in humiliation. She had passed her own test. Now Brittany Hale was about to fail hers. Guilt is a powerful motivator. It gnawed at Evan Clark all night, keeping him tossing and turning in his small apartment long after his shift had ended. The image of the waitress, the woman he now suspected was so much more, walking out that back door, was seared into his mind. He had stood there and done nothing. He had let Sal's cynical advice and Chef Anton's panicked authority keep him silent. The shame of it felt heavy in his stomach. When he arrived for his shift the next morning, the kitchen was buzzing with a nervous energy. The official story, spun by Chef Anton, was that the waitress from the night before had been a temporary staffer who had quit after the incident. It was a flimsy, transparent lie, and everyone knew it. But they also knew not to question it. The Hale wedding was too important. Evan, however, couldn't let it go. Her words to him, "Keep that passion," had felt like a torch being passed. He felt a new kind of responsibility, not just to his cooking, but to the kind of person he wanted to be. He couldn't shake the image of the embroidered RC logo. Was it possible? Could a CEO really go undercover as a waitress? It sounded like something out of a movie. During his break, driven by a need to know the truth, he logged onto a computer in the staff lounge. He navigated to the Rhodes Culinary Group's internal company portal, a vast network of files and directories. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe a staff directory, a contact list, anything with her name on it. But he didn't even have her name. He started with a broad search, typing in keywords from the night before. Solaris Division. Hale Wedding. Nothing came up. Then, on a whim, he typed in the only concrete clue he had. Founder/CEO. The search engine returned a single protected file, a company-wide memo from 6 months ago announcing the initial stages of the Solaris acquisition. Evan clicked on it. The memo was full of corporate jargon about synergy and market expansion. But at the very bottom was a digital signature. And below the signature, a name and title that made his jaw drop. Danielle Rhodes. Founder, CEO. He stared at the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Rhodes, the R in the RC logo. It was her. The quiet, dignified waitress, who had endured a storm of abuse without flinching, was the billionaire owner of the entire company. The realization washed over him in a wave of shock, awe, and a healthy dose of fear. He had been standing feet away from the most powerful person in his industry, and he hadn't even known it. The shock quickly morphed into inspiration. Her undercover mission suddenly made perfect sense. She hadn't been there to serve champagne. She had been there to see the truth, and Brittany Hale had served it to her on a silver platter. A powerful sense of purpose filled Evan. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't stand by and let the truth be buried under Chef Anton's lies. Danielle Rhodes deserved to know that not everyone in that kitchen was a coward. He found a link on the portal for executive correspondence. It was a long shot, a message in a bottle thrown into a corporate ocean. He knew it would probably be read by a dozen assistants and never reach her desk. But he had to try. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. What could he possibly say to a billionaire CEO? He decided to keep it simple, honest, and from the heart. He wrote, "To Ms. Danielle Rhodes, my name is Evan Clark. I am a sous chef at the Solaris division. I was working last night during the Hale rehearsal dinner. I saw what happened, and I wanted to say that I am sorry that no one spoke up for you. What you endured was wrong. Your calm and dignity in that moment were a lesson to us all. If you ever need someone to speak the truth about what happened or about the culture in this kitchen, I will stand by it. Respectfully, Evan Clark." He read the message over and over, his finger hovering over the send button. This was a huge risk. He could be fired for going over his superiors' heads. He could be blacklisted. But then he thought of Danielle's steady eyes. He thought of her quiet encouragement. He hit send. A sense of relief washed over him. Whatever happened next, he had done the right thing. He closed the portal and went back to the kitchen. His head held a little higher. Hours later, as Danielle Rhodes was reviewing the legal framework for terminating the Hale contract, a notification popped up on her screen. It was an alert from her executive assistant, flagging a message from the internal portal that had been marked as high priority due to its keywords. She opened it and read Evan Clark's simple, direct words. A genuine smile, the first one that day, touched her lips. In a world of corporate yes-men and fearful sycophants, here was a young chef willing to risk his job for the truth. Here was a spark of the culture she had tried to build, still alive in a place she had feared it was extinguished. Her company wasn't broken. Not completely. Not as long as it had people like Evan Clark in it. She typed a brief two-word reply, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "I might." She sent the message. The bond was formed. In a kitchen full of people who chose silence, one person had chosen courage. And in the quiet penthouse of a hidden giant, that single voice had been heard. The ally had chosen his side, and the CEO had taken notice. While the foundations of her wedding were cracking, Brittany Hale was blissfully, arrogantly unaware. She woke up the next morning in a cocoon of silk sheets and self-satisfaction. The incident at the rehearsal dinner was, in her mind, a minor annoyance that had been dealt with swiftly and appropriately. In fact, she saw it as a victory. She sat propped up against a mountain of pillows, scrolling through her phone while a bridesmaid painted her toenails a shade of pale pink. Two other bridesmaids were lounging on a chaise, flipping through a bridal magazine and offering sycophantic praise. "You were so strong last night, Britt," one of them said, not looking up from a page featuring diamond tiaras. "I can't believe that waitress had the nerve to be so careless." Brittany let out a theatrical sigh. "I know, right? It's just so hard to find good help these days. They have no sense of professionalism." She took a sip of her mimosa, basking in the attention. "Honestly, I did them a favor. By getting her fired, I probably improved their entire team. That's what leadership is about, you know? Maintaining standards." The bridesmaids murmured in agreement, their voices a chorus of blind loyalty. They were members of Brittany's court, and the Queen could do no wrong. Her fiancé, Mark Hale, walked into the room, already dressed in a sharp suit. He was the heir to a corporate empire himself, and their marriage was as much a merger as it was a romance. He had a look of weary resignation that he always wore when Brittany was in one of her moods. He leaned down to kiss her, but she turned her head, offering him her cheek. "Don't smudge my makeup, darling," she said, her eyes still glued to her phone. Mark forced a smile. He had been unsettled by her outburst the night before. It wasn't the first time he had seen her treat service staff with contempt, but the public nature of it, the sheer venom, had been embarrassing. Still, he was used to her tantrums. He had learned long ago that it was easier to placate her than to confront her. "So," Brittany said, finally looking up at him with a triumphant gleam in her eye, "aren't you lucky to have a fiancé who doesn't take disrespect from anyone? I was protecting our family's image." "You certainly made an impression," Mark said, his tone carefully neutral. He knew better than to argue. Arguing with Brittany was like arguing with a hurricane. You just had to board up the windows and wait for it to pass. Just then, Lydia, the wedding planner, entered the suite, a tablet clutched in her hand and a worried frown on her face. Lydia was a consummate professional, a woman who specialized in calming down frantic brides and solving impossible problems. But today, her usual unflappable demeanor was showing cracks. "Good morning, Brittany," she said, her voice a little too bright. "We need to finalize a few details for Saturday. I've been trying to get a hold of the catering representative from Rhodes Culinary to confirm the final head count and the updated menu." Brittany waved a dismissive hand, as if shooing away a fly. "Oh, Lydia, don't worry about that. They know who we are. They're probably just busy. These companies beg for our business. It's the Hale wedding, for goodness sake." Lydia's frown deepened. "I know, but they're usually so responsive. I've called and emailed 3 times this morning and I haven't heard anything back. It's not like them. Their service standards are usually impeccable." Brittany laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Well, their standards weren't so impeccable last night, were they? Maybe my little incident with that clumsy waitress rattled them. Good. It'll keep them on their toes." She saw the worried look that passed between Lydia and Mark, and it irritated her. Why was everyone so dramatic? It was a simple matter of cause and effect. The waitress was incompetent, so she was punished. The company was put on notice. In Brittany's world, this was how things worked. Power was meant to be used, and she had it in spades. She was a Hale, about to marry a Clark. They didn't just attend events, they were the event. Companies didn't work with them, they served them. "Lydia, relax," she said with an exasperated sigh. "Everything will be fine. It always is. Now let's talk about something more important, like the seating chart. I want to make sure my table is as far away from Mark's dreadful Aunt Carol as possible." Lydia hesitated for a moment, her professional instincts screaming that something was wrong. An unanswered call from a vendor 2 days before a major event was a massive red flag. But she looked at Brittany's smug, confident face, and she knew it was pointless to argue. She nodded and pulled up the seating chart on her tablet. As Lydia started to discuss table arrangements, Brittany leaned back against her pillows, a picture of serene arrogance. She was completely oblivious to the tectonic plates shifting beneath her perfect manicured world. She believed she had won. She had put a lowly waitress in her place and reminded a major company of who was in charge. She had no idea that her victory was a hollow one. She didn't know that the waitress she had humiliated had already signed her social death warrant. The quiet call that would seal her fate had already been made. The axe had already fallen. Brittany just hadn't heard the sound yet. That evening, as the sun set and the city transformed into a glittering tapestry of lights, Danielle Rhodes stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse. The day had been a whirlwind of quiet, decisive action. Lawyers had been consulted, contracts reviewed, and contingency plans put in place. The machine of the Rhodes Culinary Group, a machine she had built with her own 2 hands, was now turning at her command. The gears were grinding, and the target was the Hale wedding. She had spent the day in a series of video calls, her face a mask of calm authority as she gave her instructions. She spoke to her legal team, her CFO, and the head of operations. To each of them, the message was the same: clear, concise, and non-negotiable. There was no room for debate. Now, as twilight settled over the city, there was only one call left to make. This was not a call to a lawyer or an executive. This was a call to the very heart of her company's governance, the board of directors. It was a formality in a way. As the founder and majority shareholder, Her decisions were rarely questioned, but she had built her board with people she respected, and they deserved to hear the news directly from her. She moved away from the window and sat down on a simple, elegant sofa. The city lights twinkled behind her, reflecting in the dark glass of her coffee table. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over the conference call icon. She took a deep breath, not of hesitation, but of focus. She was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of her company's most promising new partnership. She was about to vaporize a billion-dollar merger proposal. She needed to be centered, clear, and absolute. She pressed the icon. A series of chimes sounded as the board members joined the call, their faces appearing in small boxes on her screen. They were a collection of seasoned executives, powerful figures in the worlds of finance, law, and hospitality. They were the guardians of her empire. "Good evening, everyone," Danielle said, her voice calm and even. It held no trace of the day's tension. "Thank you for joining me on such short notice." A few murmurs of greeting came from the speakers. Then the lead director, a silver-haired man named Arthur Vance, spoke up. "Danielle, is everything all right? This is unusual." "Everything is under control, Arthur," she replied smoothly. "I'm calling to inform the board of a decision I've made. It concerns the Solaris division and the Hale wedding contract." A flicker of interest passed through the faces on the screen. The Hale wedding was a massive, high-profile event. It was meant to be the jewel in the crown of their new acquisition. Danielle didn't waste time with pleasantries or preamble. She was a woman who dealt in facts. "Last night, I personally witnessed a violation of our company's core principles. A member of our staff was subjected to verbal abuse and public humiliation by the client, Ms. Brittany Hale." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She did not say that the staff member was her. She did not need to. Her use of witnessed was enough. "As you all know," she continued, her voice hardening slightly, "our policy on this is zero tolerance. The dignity of our team is not negotiable." The faces on the screen were now grim. They knew what was coming. "Therefore, effective immediately, I have ordered the cancellation of all services for the Hale wedding. We are terminating the contract." Silence. The word terminate hung in the virtual air. This wasn't just a catering contract, it was a relationship with one of the city's most powerful families. It was the first major test of the Solaris acquisition. Arthur Vance finally broke the silence, his voice laced with concern. "Danielle, are you sure? The financial implications, the potential damage to our reputation." "Our reputation for what, Arthur?" Danielle cut in, her voice still calm but now edged with steel. "For allowing our employees to be abused? For bowing to wealthy bullies? That is not the reputation I have spent 20 years building. The financial loss is acceptable. The loss of our integrity is not." She had their full attention now. This was not just a business decision. It was a moral one. "Furthermore," she added, delivering the final killing blow, "the proposed merger with the Hale-Clark conglomerate is, of course, off the table. We will not be entering into a billion-dollar partnership with a family that condones this kind of behavior. The risk is too high." A collective, silent intake of breath seemed to pass through the call. $1 billion. It was a staggering sum, a figure that could change the future of the company. And she was throwing it away over a single incident. But no one argued. They looked at the calm, determined face of their CEO, a woman who had started with nothing and built an empire on principles as much as profit. They saw the conviction in her eyes, and they knew she was right. "Understood, Ms. Rhodes," Arthur said, his voice now firm with support. The other board members nodded in agreement. The decision was made. The debate was over. "Thank you," Danielle said simply. She ended the call. She stood up and walked back to the window, her phone held loosely in her hand. The city below was a galaxy of lights, a world of ambition, greed, and power. For a moment she thought of Brittany Hale celebrating her petty victory. completely unaware that her world was about to go dark. Danielle felt no pleasure in it, no sense of revenge. She only felt a quiet, somber sense of justice. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass, the city lights shimmering in her eyes. It was the reflection of a woman who knew the true price of power and who was willing to pay it to protect the soul of what she had built. The quiet call was over. The storm was about to break. 2 days. That's how long Brittany Hale's smug satisfaction lasted. 2 days before her wedding. She arrived at the Solaris Hotel's grand ballroom with Lydia, the wedding planner, for the final walkthrough. She was expecting to see a hive of activity, tables being set with fine china, floral arrangements being placed, and the quiet, efficient hum of the Rhodes culinary staff making magic happen. Instead, they walked into an empty, cavernous hall. The silence was the first thing that hit them. It was a dead, hollow sound, punctuated only by the echo of their own footsteps on the polished marble floor. There were no tables, no chairs, no flowers, no staff. The room was a ghost of the glittering party it was supposed to host in less than 48 hours. "What is this?" Brittany demanded, her voice sharp with irritation. "Where is everyone? Lydia, did you get the time wrong?" Lydia's face had turned a sickly shade of pale. She was frantically tapping at her phone, her thumb swiping across the screen with growing panic. "No, the walkthrough was scheduled for 10 a.m. I confirmed it yesterday." Her voice was a thin, reedy whisper. "I don't understand." She put the phone to her ear. "I'm calling Chef Anton again. He hasn't answered any of my calls since yesterday." The call went straight to voicemail. Again. She tried the main line for the Solaris Catering division. An automated message informed her that the number was no longer in service. A cold chill, colder than the air-conditioned ballroom, began to creep up Lydia's spine. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. She made another call, this time to a contact she had at a rival catering company. "Hey, Sarah, it's Lydia Summers," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Quick question. Have you heard anything strange about the Rhodes culinary team at the Solaris?" "What? Are you sure?" Lydia's hand, the one holding the phone, dropped to her side. The color had completely drained from her face. She looked like she had seen a ghost. "Lydia, what is it?" Brittany snapped, her patience worn thin. "What did she say?" Lydia looked at Brittany, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "They pulled out," she whispered. The words seemed to get stuck in her throat. "Rhodes Culinary. They've pulled out of the wedding. Completely. They reassigned all the staff, canceled all the orders. They're gone." Brittany stared at her, her mind refusing to process the information. "Pulled out? They can't pull out. We have a contract. I'll sue them. I'll ruin them." "You don't understand," Lydia said, her voice trembling now. "The entire division at the Solaris has been shut down, effective immediately. There's a rumor spreading like wildfire through the industry. Something about a major incident with a client." Brittany's angry bluster began to falter, replaced by a dawning sense of dread. "An incident?" And then Lydia delivered the line that would shatter Brittany's world into a million pieces. She had been doing some frantic digging, connecting the dots, talking to panicked sources. The impossible rumor was solidifying into a terrifying truth. She looked at the entitled, arrogant bride who had caused this mess, and she spoke the words that sealed her fate. "The owner," Lydia whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast, empty room. "The rumor is, the owner of the entire Rhodes culinary group was working undercover at the rehearsal dinner. The owner was that waitress." Freeze. The word waitress hung in the air between them. Brittany's jaw dropped. A strangled, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. That's impossible. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. She was nobody. A clumsy, incompetent nobody." But even as she said the words, a sickening feeling of certainty began to curdle in her stomach. She remembered the waitress's unnerving calm. She remembered those steady, assessing eyes that held no fear. It was the look of someone who held all the cards. Her denial was drowned out by the buzz of her own phone. Then Lydia's. Then another. It was a cascade of notifications. The news was breaking. Employees from the now-defunct Solaris division, free from their non-disclosure agreements, were starting to talk. Cryptic posts were appearing all over social media. A sous chef posted a picture of a perfectly seared scallop with the caption, "Passion is worthless without respect. #New beginnings." A line cook posted a simple message. Respect matters more than money. The hashtag #HailNo was starting to trend. The truth was spreading, not as a whisper, but as a digital roar. And Brittany Hale was at the center of it, standing in an empty ballroom, the architect of her own spectacular downfall. The world she had built on a foundation of wealth and status was crumbling around her. And it had all started with a single, dismissive word. Clumsy. The waitress she had tried to fire had just fired her entire wedding. The fallout was swift and brutal. While Brittany was still reeling in the empty ballroom, her world shrinking to the size of a trending hashtag, her fiancé was dealing with a much more significant and devastating consequence. Mark Hale was in a board meeting at his father's company, Hale Clark Conglomerate, when his phone vibrated with an urgent message from his assistant. It simply said, "Danielle Rhodes is on the line for you. She says it is non-negotiable." Mark excused himself from the meeting, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. Why would the CEO of Rhodes Culinary be calling him directly? He stepped into his private office and took the call, forcing a confident, friendly tone into his voice. "Ms. Rhodes, what a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" There was no warmth in the voice that answered him. It was cool, professional, and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Mr. Hale, I am calling to inform you of a change in our business relationship." Mark's forced smile faltered. "A change? I'm not sure I understand." "Let me be clear," Danielle's voice continued, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Due to the verbal abuse directed at my employee by your fiancée, Ms. Brittany Hale, during your rehearsal dinner, Rhodes Culinary Group has decided not to continue with our contract. We will not be catering your wedding." Mark was stunned into silence. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. His mind raced, trying to process the words. This is a misunderstanding. Brittany was just... She was stressed. The wedding... "It is not a misunderstanding, Mr. Hale," Danielle interrupted, her tone even and unyielding. "It is a matter of corporate policy. We do not tolerate the mistreatment of our staff. Not for any price." The finality in her voice was absolute, but the worst was yet to come. "Furthermore," Danielle said, and Mark could almost hear the guillotine blade being released, "as a result of this incident, we will be withdrawing our interest in the proposed merger. The $1.2 billion partnership between Rhodes Culinary Group and Hale Clark Conglomerate is now officially off the table." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He staggered back, slumping into his chair. $1.2 billion. It was a deal he had personally spearheaded for the last year. It was meant to be his crowning achievement, the move that would cement his position as the future of the Hale Clark Conglomerate. "Ms. Rhodes, Danielle, please," he stammered, his voice trembling. The confident businessman was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading man. This is a catastrophic mistake. We can fix this. I'll have Brittany apologize. We'll make a donation to a charity of your choice. Anything." "Mr. Hale," Danielle replied, and her voice was not unkind, but it was as final as a locked door. The time for apologies was on the night of the incident. The time for charity was when my employee was being humiliated in front of 200 people. You cannot buy your way out of a character deficit. My decision stands." The line went dead. Mark sat in his office, the silence ringing in his ears. He stared at his phone, his mind a maelstrom of panic and fury. $1 billion. Gone. His reputation, his future, his family's company, All of it was now in jeopardy because of one of Brittany's temper tantrums. He stormed out of his office and drove to the Solaris Hotel. He found Brittany in her bridal suite, surrounded by her shell-shocked bridesmaids and a frantic Lydia. Brittany was pacing back and forth, alternating between furious rants and tearful sobs. "I'll sue her! I'll destroy her!" she shrieked as Mark walked in. "She can't do this to me!" Mark looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a beautiful, powerful fiancée. He saw a liability, a spoiled, petulant child who had just set fire to his entire life. He waited for her to pause for breath, his voice dangerously quiet. "She can," he said. Brittany stopped pacing and stared at him. "What did you say?" "I said, she can," Mark repeated, his voice cold and flat. "And she did. I just got off the phone with her, Brittany, with Danielle Rhodes, the waitress." He told her about the call. He told her about the canceled contract. And then he told her about the billion-dollar merger. As he spoke, Brittany's face went through a series of transformations. The anger drained away, replaced by disbelief. The disbelief was replaced by horror, and the horror was replaced by a stark, bone-white terror. She sank onto the sofa, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out, speechless. Mark stood over her, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked at the woman he was supposed to marry in 2 days, the woman who had just cost his family a fortune, and him his future. "You," he whispered, the single word filled with a universe of contempt. "You didn't just ruin our wedding. You lost us $1 billion. He turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving Brittany alone with the wreckage of her arrogance. The summons came via a cold, formal email. Brittany Hale and Mark Hale were requested to attend a meeting at the Rhodes Culinary Group headquarters the following morning. The purpose was to discuss the breach of contract and finalize the dissolution of all pending agreements. For Brittany, it was a lifeline, a chance to apologize, to beg, to fix it. She still believed that her name, her money, and her tears could solve any problem. Mark knew better, but he agreed to go, driven by a grim sense of duty, to witness the final act of the disaster she had created. They were led not to an office, but to a vast, intimidating boardroom. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the sterile lights overhead. At one end of the room was a massive video screen. A team of stone-faced lawyers and board members sat on one side of the table, their expressions unreadable. This was not a negotiation. It was a tribunal. Brittany and Mark sat on the other side, a vast and empty space between them and their accusers. A camera was mounted in the corner of the room. A lawyer informed them in a monotone voice that the proceedings were being recorded for internal audit and documentation purposes. The trap was set. The courtroom drama was about to begin. The boardroom doors opened, and a wave of silence fell over the room. Danielle Rhodes entered. She was not wearing a waitress's uniform. She was not wearing a simple sweatsuit. She was dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored white CEO suit. Her hair was styled perfectly. Her posture radiated a power that was both quiet and absolute. She moved with an unhurried grace that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. A collective gasp rippled through the staff and junior executives who had been invited to observe from the sidelines. They had all heard the rumors, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The waitress from the viral social media posts was the queen of the empire. Brittany stared, her eyes wide with shock. The transformation was so complete, so staggering, that her brain couldn't reconcile the two images. "You," she stammered, her voice a pathetic squeak. She was speechless. Danielle did not look at Brittany. Not yet. She took her seat at the head of the table, the seat of ultimate authority. She surveyed the room, her calm, steady eyes meeting the gaze of every person there. Then, and only then, did she turn her attention to the disgraced bride. The same calm eyes that had met Brittany's insults in the ballroom now held the weight of a billion-dollar empire. "Ms. Hale," Danielle began, her voice as smooth and polished as the table between them. "We are here to discuss the events of 2 nights ago." She recounted what had happened, her tone neutral and factual, like a newscaster reading a report. She spoke of the spilled champagne. She repeated Brittany's words, every single cruel, dismissive syllable. "Watch where you're going, Clumsy. This gown costs more than you make in a year. Cheap, ugly uniform. I want her fired." The words hung in the sterile air of the boardroom, stripped of their anger and left with only their ugly, naked meaning. Then Danielle nodded to an aide. The massive screen at the end of the room flickered to life. The security footage from the ballroom began to play. The entire room watched in stunned silence. They saw the spill. They heard the gasp. And then they heard Brittany's voice, shrill and venomous, echoing through the boardroom's high-tech sound system. They saw her finger pointing, her face twisted in a mask of rage. They saw the waitress, Danielle, standing still and silent, absorbing the abuse with a dignity that was heartbreaking to watch. When the video ended, the screen went black, plunging the room into a profound, heavy silence. The board members looked grim. The staff members lining the walls were stunned, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning respect for the woman at the head of the table. Danielle let the silence stretch, forcing everyone to sit with the ugliness of what they had just witnessed. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "At Rhodes Culinary Group," she said, looking not at Brittany but at her own staff, at her board, "we have a simple philosophy. It is the foundation of everything we do. Our clients are our partners, not our masters. Our staff are our greatest asset, not our servants." She turned her gaze back to Brittany, her eyes holding no malice, only a profound sense of finality. "What you did, Ms. Hale, was not just an insult to an employee. It was an attack on the values of this entire company. Here, respect is not optional, it's policy." The words landed like a judge's gavel. The trial was over. The verdict was in. Brittany Hale was guilty, and she had been judged not by a clumsy waitress, but by the powerful CEO she had tried and failed to break. The dam of Brittany's composure finally broke. The public shaming, the loss of her wedding, the billion-dollar failure, it all crashed down on her at once. She crumpled, her carefully constructed facade of arrogance dissolving into messy, desperate sobs. "I'm sorry," she wept, her words choked and barely coherent. "Please, I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking." She looked at Danielle, her eyes pleading. "Please, give me another chance. I'll do anything. I'll apologize publicly. I'll pay for the damages." Danielle remained composed, her expression unchanging. She listened to the pleas, the excuses, the frantic bargaining. She had heard it all before. This was not the apology of a person who had learned a lesson. It was the panic of a person who had been caught. When Brittany's sobs subsided into hiccuping breaths, Danielle spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "You are not sorry for what you did, Ms. Hale. You are sorry for the consequences. There is a difference." She let that statement hang in the air for a moment. "You have, however, provided a valuable service to this company. You taught everyone here what entitlement looks like," she said, gesturing to the staff and board members watching. "You gave us a perfect, real-world example of the very behavior our policies are designed to prevent." She paused, her eyes locking onto Brittany's. "Now they will see what accountability means." Danielle turned to her legal counsel. "Ms. Hale, and any business entities associated with her or her immediate family, are to be permanently banned from all future contracts with the Rhodes Culinary Group and its subsidiaries. Is that clear?" The lawyer nodded. "Perfectly clear, Ms. Rhodes." The word permanently was a final, brutal blow. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was a lifetime ban from one of the most prestigious luxury service providers in the world. It was a social death sentence. Humiliation washed over Mark's face. He had sat through the entire proceeding in stony silence, but this was the final straw. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He didn't look at Brittany. He couldn't. He looked at Danielle. "We understand," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage and embarrassment. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, his footsteps echoing the finality of his departure. He was walking out on the meeting. He was walking out on the deal. He was walking out on her. The doors closed behind him, leaving Brittany utterly alone. But the scene was not over. Danielle had one more piece of business to attend to. She turned to her assistant. "Please ask Mr. Clark to come in." A moment later, the boardroom doors opened again, and Evan Clark stepped inside. He was wearing his chef's whites, looking nervous and out of place in the corporate setting. He looked from the crying bride to the powerful CEO, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Danielle stood up and walked over to him, a warm, genuine smile on her face. The entire room watched as the billionaire CEO stood before the young sous chef. "Mr. Clark," she said, her voice clear and strong. "In a kitchen full of people who chose to look away, you were the only one who had the courage to see. You sent a message, not knowing who I was, simply because you believed it was the right thing to do. That is not something I will soon forget." Evan was stunned, speechless. He could only nod. "Integrity," Danielle continued, turning to address the room, "is a quality that cannot be taught, but it must be rewarded. The position of executive chef for our new flagship restaurant is now open. The job is yours if you want it." Evan's jaw dropped. Executive chef. It was a promotion that would have taken him another 10 years to earn. It was a dream he barely dared to have. He looked at Danielle, at the powerful woman who had seen something in him, and his eyes filled with tears. Not of shame, but of overwhelming gratitude. He had stood up for a waitress, and in return the CEO had handed him his future. The contrast was stark and brutal. On one side of the room, a bride who had lost everything due to her arrogance. On the other, a chef who had gained everything through his integrity. The lesson was clear, and everyone in the room understood it perfectly. Days after the boardroom confrontation, the story was no longer just industry gossip. It was a national headline. A major news outlet published a detailed exposé titled, "How a Clumsy Waitress Canceled a Billion-Dollar Deal. Black CEO Teaches Powerful Lesson in Humility." The article went viral. It was shared millions of times, dominating social media feeds and morning talk shows. The public reaction was overwhelming and almost universally positive. People were tired of stories of entitled rich people getting away with bad behavior. Danielle Rhodes became an overnight folk hero. She was praised for her courage, her integrity, and her brilliant undercover operation. Support poured in for the Rhodes Culinary Group. Their stock prices soared. New clients, impressed by the company's strong ethical stance, flooded their booking lines. The financial loss from the Hale contract was quickly dwarfed by a massive wave of new business and goodwill. Danielle had gambled on her principles, and she had won, spectacularly. She called a company-wide meeting which was broadcast to every division and subsidiary across the country. Standing on a simple stage, dressed in an elegant but understated dress, she addressed her thousands of employees. "There will be many who say that our recent actions were about making a point," she said, her voice calm and resonant. "They will say it was about punishing the wealthy, or about creating a viral moment. They are wrong. This was not about one client, one wedding, or $1 billion deal. This was about reaffirming who we are." She looked out at the faces of her staff, from the executive VPs in the front row to the dishwashers watching on a screen in a basement kitchen. "The real currencies of our success are not dollars and cents. They are dignity and kindness. Every one of you, no matter your title or your role, is the heart of this company. You deserve to be treated with respect, and you should be proud to work for a company that will walk away from any deal, no matter how big, to protect that principle." The applause was thunderous and heartfelt. It was a moment of profound unity and shared pride. Meanwhile, Evan Clark was starting his new role. He walked into the kitchen of the flagship restaurant, no longer a junior chef, but the man in charge. The pressure was immense, but so was his gratitude. He was determined to live up to the faith Danielle had shown in him. He ran his kitchen with a new philosophy, one he had learned firsthand. A team that feels respected will always create the best food. He treated every member of his staff, from the sous chefs to the pot scrubbers, with the dignity they deserved. His passion, once just for cooking, had expanded to include a passion for leadership. He was not just building menus, he was building a better kitchen culture, inspired by the CEO who had given him a chance. As for Brittany Hale, her fall from grace was as quiet as her rise had been loud. The wedding was, of course, cancelled. Mark Hale broke off the engagement through a short formal letter from his lawyer. Shamed and abandoned, Brittany vanished from the social circles that had once been her entire world. The invitations stopped coming. The calls were no longer returned. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties, a synonym for arrogance and its consequences. She was left with nothing but her expensive, useless wedding gifts and the hollow echo of her own entitlement, forced to reflect on the wreckage she had made. The public that had once been fascinated by her lavish lifestyle now pitied and forgot her, a far worse fate for someone so desperate to be seen. In a world obsessed with status, remember, the person you mock may own the room you stand in. Power wears many faces, but true greatness walks quietly until disrespected. The screen fades on Danielle looking out over the city skyline, calm and composed, a reminder that grace and justice, when paired, are unstoppable. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.